This was a project that originally began in 2016 in partnership with Leicester City Council as a community excavation funded by the National Lottery Fund. And that ran for 2 years in 2016, 2017 as an opportunity for members of the local area and the wider region to join an excavation investigating the archaeology and the history of the park. And that was part of a wider City Council Parks project exploring the histories of all of their parks. That ended in 2017 and the project then sat there for a little while. Then the pandemic happened. And then last year, the University of Leicester was looking for a new field school location for its first and second year students, the second year students having missed out on their original field school from the first year. And Castle Hill presented effectively a ready-made project with research questions that were unfinished. So last summer, we went back and carried out a third season of excavation over 4 or 5 weeks. And it also gave us the opportunity this time round to pitch it for Digging for Britain and actually get it on TV and showcase what is a fantastic but largely up to this point unrecognised site. So the way Digging for Britain works is you pitch your project to them, and if they like the idea, they send you a camera to record the project yourself. So what they ask for you to do is sort of try and capture all the key moments during the project and do dig diaries amongst yourself, which is really difficult to do because you sort of tend to forget most of the time, or you're distracted by actually doing the archaeology and you've forgotten to actually then video it. And then on some projects, the ones they particularly like and the ones they particularly want to showcase on the programme, they then send Alice out, who effectively was doing a massive tour of the country throughout the summer in a camper van, driving around and visiting all of these different excavations. And so we then spent a day and a half on site filming with Alice herself, which is most of what you see actually on the TV programme is the stuff we filmed directly with Alice. We were fortunate in that they decided they really liked this project and spent quite a long time with us on this one, which made up for my lack of recording stuff during other bits of the dig, fortunately. To locate this project then, Castle Hill Country Park is Leicester's largest but probably least recognised country park. So it sits right on the northwest edge of the city and was created effectively to create a green belt between the urban sprawl of the suburban development of Beaumont Leys and the county villages of Anstey, Cropston, Thurkeston, and so forth. Today, Beaumont Leys is probably best recognised as being the factory site for the Walker's Crisp factory. But on the edge of it, there is this huge swathe, 240 acres of grassland and woodland straddling the A46 that really people don't realise is a country park. If you're driving along the A46, you don't notice it. You're in the cutting effectively and you drive straight through it without really recognising it's there. And otherwise, it's really only used by the locals who actually live immediately neighbouring the park because it has no public car parks or anything. You've got to park in the housing estates to use it. So really, it's only used by local dog walkers. And many other people in Leicester just don't know it exists. It gets its name from a scheduled monument within the eastern edge of the park, the Castle Hill itself. And that was our focus of investigation. Now, Castle Hill, again, despite its name, it seems to have largely been missed by antiquaries writing about the history and archaeology of Leicester and its surrounding area. It really isn't until the late 19th century that we start actually getting local historians speculating about its purpose and function. And it's really not until the late 19th century that it actually starts appearing as a drawn earthwork on maps as well. So the earliest speculation about it was by a local historian called F.T. Mott. And in 1891, he published one of the sort of first surveyed plans of the site and was speculating that it might be a British, Roman or Anglo-Saxon encampment. And he was drawing analogy with another site only sort of 5 miles to the west of our site on the same river valley called Bury Camp, which is a large playing card shaped earthwork that again has never been investigated, but has in the past produced Iron Age pottery from surface collection. And so, given the similarities in the shape of the two monuments, he was suggesting that it might have this, effectively he's sort of suggesting it might be a hill fort or a Roman fort or something to that effect. And you can see why when you look at the landscape. The site sits on a promontory projecting out from the high ridge of ground that separates the valley of the Soar, where Leicester sits, which you can see at the top of the photograph, and the Rothley Brook, which is sort of behind the viewpoint of this photograph. So the big monstrosity of factories, that's the Walker's Crisp factory there. And so the earthwork effectively surrounds that promontory, and so it does have that look of a single ditch, a univalate hill fort. It has a commanding prospect across the Rothley Brook Valley as well, towards the high ground on the other side, which is the Charnwood Hills and the Charnwood Forest. And so you have at the very back there, you've got Beacon Hill, which was another hill fort, and Bury Camp is off to the left, about 5 miles away as well. So it has this wider landscape that it could, prehistoric landscape that it could fit into as well. More recently, however, historical research suggests it might have an alternate purpose, and that might be that it's a medieval manorial site specifically linked with the Knights Hospitaller. However, as the site before we investigate it has never been looked at before, there was actually no reason why it couldn't be both of those things. It could entirely have been a prehistoric or Roman monument that had been repurposed in the medieval period. And that was one of our key research questions, and actually one of our research questions that we only actually answered last year. We'd failed to answer it in the first 2 seasons. It was one of the reasons why I was so keen to go back for a 3rd season, was we still didn't have an answer until last year of the actual origin of the monument. The Knights Hospitallers then, or the Order of the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, as their full title is, they originated as a hospice for pilgrims in Jerusalem in the late 11th century, and then militarized after the conquest of Jerusalem during the First Crusade. And they were effectively charged, like their brethren, the Knights Templars, with the care and defense of the Holy Land. But because of this hospice origin of this order, they also always had that element of providing care for the sick, poor and injured pilgrims that were visiting the Holy Land and journeying to the Holy Land as well. They are a monastic order. They took the same three monastic vows of poverty, chastity and obedience as other orders. And they also uniquely took a 4th vow to care for the sick. And after the fall of Jerusalem at the end of the 13th century, they then successively operated out of Cyprus, then Rhodes, and then Malta. And they do still exist in a form in Malta as the Knights of Malta. In Britain, then, they started acquiring properties in Britain in the early 12th century, specifically in England initially. And by the end of the 12th century, that had then been formalised into something called the Priory of England, which did include Wales and Scotland. They didn't really hold many properties in Scotland at all, and only a handful in Wales as well. That priory then was administered from their main base within England, which was at Clerkenwell in London. And all the other properties were effectively manorial sites that would generate a revenue for the hospitallers that would then fund their charitable activities and their duties in fighting and causes in the Holy Land, effectively. So in England, then, all of these properties were then subdivided down into sort of loose geographical administration regions called bailiwicks. And we have this fantastic Doomsday-esque survey of the Knights Hospitallers' holdings in England from 1338, where the prior at the time, a man called Philip de Tame, did a massive survey of all the holdings in England to try and calculate how profitable the priory actually was and how much money they could actually generate to send abroad for their causes abroad. And that gives us an incredible insight into the Hospitallers' sort of setup in England. So we know in 1338 there was 116 professed Hospitallers in England, and that comprised 34 knights, 24 chaplains, and 48 sergeants. They were scattered across the country, then administering the various properties. The survey also lists 106 dependents, 400 servants, 70 secular priests also serving the order, and 50 sisters. So the Hospitallers did have a sister order as well. They were then divided into these bailiwicks, and the main site administering a bailiwick was called a preceptory. So there was about 37 in England in 1338. So they were the sort of part estate centre, part religious house, part hospice, effectively. And these would have been where the professed Hospitallers were primarily based. And then all of the other holdings they get divided down into various other categories. And so you get sites called camera, which were effectively independent manors. So they were, whilst they might be in the region of a bailiwick, they weren't administered directly by the bailiwick. They were managed in absentia, usually for high-ranking Hospitallers or as demesne estates of Clerkenwell. And then we get membra sites, which were the dependent manors of the bailiwick, effectively. And then there's a whole host of other pieces of land, churches, mills, hospitals, and one sister house in England as well. The Hospitallers then held all of this land until 1540, when it is forfeited to the Crown when the order is dissolved in Britain. In Leicester then, in Leicestershire, we can then see that from this survey, we can see in other records, we can see the Hospitallers started acquiring a scattering of properties across the county in the late 12th century. And these were all primarily administered from their preceptory at Old Dolby in the north of the county. Most of this land was leased out to managers and bailiffs, effectively, rather than it being directly run by Hospitallers. Indeed, the survey itself only lists 2 Hospitallers present in the county in 1338, the senior and preceptor, a man called John Larcher, who was a professed knight, and his deputy, a man called Peter de Hay, who was listed as a sergeant at arms. So in the county then we have the preceptory, the main site, which is described as being arable and pastoral in terms of its manorial output. We then have our site, which is a dependent site at Beaumont, which is also arable and pastoral. So Beaumont, the site at Castle Hill, is specifically described as a membra site. There's also then farmland at Heather and Peatling. There's water mills at Heather, windmills at Dolby and Grimston, a couple of dovecots at Dolby, orchards at Dolby and Beaumont. So we start getting this idea of the sort of land they're holding. We also know from the survey that they were in the county, they were using the vicar of Dolby as their chaplain, a man called John de Barrow. And they also had 3 dependents or pensioners at Dolby called William de Barnaby, Richard Bannister and Robert Runting. And they were probably either local gentry who had decided to retire effectively. So they'd probably given a large grant of money or land to the Hospitallers in exchange for care for the rest of their lives. Or they may have been actually pensioned Hospitallers themselves. We also have 12 servants listed. So there's the preceptor's squire, a chamberlain, a keyholder, a cook, a baker, an oxherd, swineherd, shepherd, 2 grooms, a bailiff, and a woodkeeper. When we look at our site specifically then at Castle Hill, originally it formed part of the manor of Thurkeston. So Thurkeston is just north of our site, about a mile to the north of our site, and our manor site, effectively the Hospitallers' manor, formed the southern portion of that Thurkeston manor. In 1240 then the manor, Thurkeston manor, was split, and Simon de Montfort, the 6th Earl of Leicester, granted the southern portion of it, or he sold off the very southern portion of it to Leicester Abbey, then granted the rest of the southern portion to the Knights Hospitallers, whilst sort of effectively separating it from the manor of Thurkeston, which then descended through its local lords independent of the site at Castle Hill. They seem to have held then the Hospitallers at Beaumont about somewhere between 720 and 960 acres. So it's 8 caracots of land is what's described. In the early 14th century, a fish pond is mentioned at Bealmont as well. And then in 1307, we get a reference to the brother of the Master of Beaumont, which suggests possibly that there might have been a Knights Hospitaller in residence in the early 14th century in 1307 at Castle Hill. He was specifically linked with a case in Leicester where someone, a merchant in Leicester, had been illegally buying wool from Beaumont, basically. So he wasn't himself in trouble, it was the merchant. But it gives us a suggestion then that given its location on this high ground between Leicester and the River Soar and the Rothley Brook, that its arable land was actually perhaps in a minority. There's about 720 acres of arable land in the 1338 survey, which suggests that there's between 500 and 740 acres perhaps of meadow, pasture and woodland, which suggests that Castle Hill was perhaps primarily a sheep farm rather than an arable manorial site. So the 1338 survey then references a house at Castle Hill. It references 220 acres of arable land, meadows, pasture and an orchard. And these were all being administered by 1338 by a bailiff and a wood keeper, which again suggests there was quite a lot of woodland, managed woodland around as well. In this case, though, at Beaumont, the site wasn't actually forfeited to the Crown when the order was dissolved. It had actually been handed over to the King before that. In 1482, the Hospitallers actually exchanged the manor at Beaumont with the rectory of St Botolph at Boston in Lincolnshire, with Edward IV. Basically, Edward IV wanted to extend the neighbouring Royal Hunting Park over the area where the Hospitallers were, and so they did a land swap effectively. Edward IV taking the manor so he could extend the Royal Deer Park, and the Hospitallers in exchange getting a profitable rectory in Lincolnshire. By 1524, then the park was described as being well stocked with deer, about 800 deer and 2 fair lodges standing in the park. It really never fulfilled its potential as a deer park. It didn't help that Edward IV actually died the year after he acquired the land, and so his vision possibly was never fully realised. And by 1526, then it had been disparked by Henry VIII and leased out as arable land. By 1572, then Elizabeth I grants the manor of Beaumont Lees, as it's now called, to Sir Henry Skipworth. And by 1686, it's actually been sold off and owned by a man called Sir William Rawlinson, who's divided it down into a series of farms. And we have an incredible estate map from that period, from the Rawlinson estate, surveyed in 1686, which actually shows what we believe is effectively the entire Knights Hospitallers manorial site. So on the left, at the top, you've got Leicester Town and Leicester Abbey, and then you've got the other surrounding villages, Belgrave, Birstall, Thurkston, Cropston and Anstey. And all of this land you can see in the middle is the estate of the Rawlinson estate, and the colours surrounding the different fields represent the 4 different farms within the estate. So Beaumont Lees, the main farm, is actually now on the south side of the high ground, and the 2 lodges that are probably represented in the mentioned in the Deer Park are probably these 2 on the right hand side, at Astle Lodge and the one to the north of it. Our site is this field here. It's called the Orchard, and the fact that it's called the Orchard is really the only clue that there was something on the site predating it as a field. The only other evidence on this map that shows something was going on here is 2 possible ponds on one side of the property as well. But really, the orchard, referencing back to the reference to that medieval orchard perhaps, is really the only indication amongst all the other field names surrounding it that something different to field or meadow might have been going on the site. And perhaps the reason why no one's ever really taken a closer look at it until now is because between 1885 and 1901, The field was transferred to the Leicester Corporation and turned into part of the sewage disposal works linked with the City Farms agricultural scheme. And that covered the whole of the Beaumont-Lees Plateau area, with sewage from Leicester being pumped up from the Abbey pumping station next to the River Soar through a whole series of culverts and then pumped out onto all of the fields in the area. And you can see on the map on the right, our site, you can see the actual earthwork of it. And you can see there are culverts pumping out, going directly into the field. And the image on the left from the 1960s shows you our site with the earthwork visible amongst all the channels and culverts that are pumping out sewage over the whole area. Although at the same time, it was also still under grassland, and you can also see sheep in the fields at the same time. So it seems to be, in our area at least, that they were pumping out wastewater rather than actual solids, and allowing it to then naturally filter down through the soils and then drain into the Rothley Brook. But in 1913, there's a description of it that says the work stands on a sewage farm and channels are cut all about the work and the adjoining land for the filth to run over the same. Hence, it is not a very pleasant, not a pleasant or very safe to walk about. And so effectively, no one had really ever taken a closer look because of this. The sewage farm operated until 1964 when it was closed, and then in the 1970s and 1980s, the former fields of the sewage farm then started to get converted into the Beaumont-Lees satellite town as part of Leicester's expansion to the north. And at this time in 1980, then, to protect the earthwork from that encroaching development, it was scheduled. And in 1984, the Castle Hill Country Park was created around it to protect the monument, but also to try and protect and create that green belt between sort of Leicester's urban expansion and the countryside beyond. Today, when you walk around the site, the field itself, because of its protected nature, is generally kept as a wild life site, and so the grass is usually allowed to stay long. We have to get it mowed every year when we dig there. And we have to sort of mow it at certain points to avoid ground nesting birds and everything. But it's generally kept as a wild refuge area, which often means when you're walking across the site on its many paths today that you don't actually really appreciate the earthwork. The scale of it is too big, and in areas the earthworks are too slight to actually they sort of merge into the long grass and you don't always see them. The monument itself, it's about 160 metres north to south and 130 metres east to west. So it covers a large area with an outer ditch and a bank, effectively, a ditch and a rampart. So as a good example, here's an image from last year from Google Earth. In fact, you can actually see our excavations from last year on the image. But you can also say you can only just about make out the rectangular outline of the earthwork amongst all the cow parsley and long grass. But when we look at the site using, for instance, LiDAR, we can see much clearer the complexity of the earthworks on the site. We can effectively strip away all the vegetation, and we then get a much clearer idea of the shape and scale of the monument. You've got this large outer bank and ditch. You've got a whole host of other sort of activity and earthworks going on inside. Some of it could be related to the use of it as its original enclosure. Other of it bits may be sewage farm activity or other later use on the site. And then surrounding it, you've got all of this sort of parallel lines of ridge and furrow, cross-cut by lots of other linears. See, all these snaking linears are sewage channels. They match up with aerial photographs of the sewage farm. And then at the northern end of the site, you've got this large bank, which is the remains of the dam of the fish pond that once filled the whole bottom bit of the valley at the foot of the Castle Hill. And my label says Danken Ditch, I've just noticed. So we've got a whole host of things we could look at here in relation to the monument. We've got these central earth mounds, we've got various what look like enclosures within the main enclosure, we've got banks and ditches on the outside, we've got the fish pond. All of these things could be investigated as part of the project. So where to start effectively? So one of the very early things that we did for this project was a geophysical survey back in 2015 to try and get a sense of what's going on inside the main enclosure. Unfortunately, the magnetometry survey did not reveal much. In fact, it even struggled to show the outer bank and ditch. There seems to be a lot of modern metal contamination in the topsoil, probably linked with the sewage farm, that is just in areas is just sort of fuzzing out anything underneath it. And in other areas, these sort of areas on the right-hand image that are shown as blue were interpreted at the time as areas of modern rubble and debris, again linked with the sewage farm, and they seem to be masking anything that might be underneath. In fact, there was only one possible structure that popped out on the geophysical survey, a rectangular structure in the centre of the site near one of the earth mounds. Which meant really we were faced with putting in some targeted trenching in 2016 to try and get a handle on what the geophysical survey was showing us and to get a better sense of the site. That was then followed up in 2017 by excavations expanding on what we'd found in the first year and some random trenching to just get a sense of what else is inside the earthwork. So trenches 7 and 8 were just randomly placed effectively to just see if there was anything there. And then last year is the area we excavated in the yellow areas, is the trenching we excavated last year. So we were looking at, again, expanding this main central area of the site from previous excavations, and then looking at some other elements of the monument that we hadn't previously investigated. Trench 11 in particular was key this year because we still didn't have an actual date for the outer bank and ditch. Trenches 1 and 4 had both failed to actually date the monument, although they'd given us a good look at it. So the eastern bank and ditch then, one of the very first things we investigated showed that the earthwork has got this large outer ditch, and the bank is built up of stone rubble effectively, and clay that has presumably been dug out of the ditch. The rampart in this particular area was about 12 meters wide, but that had flattened and spread over time. The field had been put back into arable use at some point. It hasn't always been pasture since the medieval period, so ploughing has flattened some of the earthworks a bit. The ditch has also silted in with wash from the bank, filling back in the ditch again. But this particular area on the eastern bank, we also identified that there was a 6 meter wide break in the ditch, suggesting this was an entrance, and there was also hints that it had been paved at one point. And this seemed to correspond with an area on the LiDAR which seemed to suggest there was a break between the ridge and furrow, leading directly towards where that break was. So we've now identified, because there's actually no obvious circuit in the break in the circuit around the earthwork that sort of you could reasonably suggest is an entrance. All the breaks you see at the minute seem to correspond with where sewage channels have cut through the earthwork, rather than there being an actual entrance. So the excavations on the eastern side, whilst it still hadn't dated the construction of the outer bank and ditch, did identify an entrance into the site from the high ground beyond. I'm pretty sure there's going to be more than one entrance to this site. I don't think realistically that people from the valley coming up would sort of go all the way round the earthwork to get into it from the high ground. I suspect there is at least one other entrance somewhere on the other side. We just haven't spotted where it is yet. So with the failure of the eastern excavation to date the outer bank and ditch, one of our key goals this year on the northern side was to try and get this definitive date for the earthwork. So was it an Iron Age hill fort that had been repurposed? Was it a Roman encampment that had been repurposed? Or was it always entirely medieval in its use? We picked the northern side to try and answer this question. We thought we'd have the best chance of success here, because when you again look at the LiDAR seems to suggest that the ridge and furrow, the medieval ridge and furrow, might actually go underneath the bank at this point. It seems to be cropping up on the inside of the enclosure. It's fainter on the inside, but it seems to be a continuation of what you can see on the outside. So this was one of our key things we were able to show Alice this year and record. We were effectively, by the time she turned up on site, we had actually proved this question, which was great. It wasn't something we needed to sort of film in afterwards we could actually do it live on site. So the bank, when you're actually standing outside the monument on the north side, the bank is quite impressive. It's not particularly impressive on the inside of the monument, but when you're standing outside, it is. And effectively, it is just the clay cast up from the construction of the ditch, which you can see where the two archaeologists are digging out a section through the ditch at the bottom of the photo. And I picked this one because Alice and me actually give quite a good sense of scale for the bank here. What we were able to prove this year then was that the bank itself, which has produced a bit of Roman pottery, the bank is constructed on top of a soil layer that has produced medieval pottery. So the outer bank and ditch, we are now 100% confident, is of medieval date. There is no Iron Age hill fort or Roman encampment. The whole monument on the top of the hill is medieval and probably linked with this manorial site with the Knights Hospitaller. The bank and ditch, when you fully excavate it, are really quite impressive. The ditch is close to 5 meters in width and it's a good couple of meters deep. It's been redug out a couple of times at least, and that soil has then all been cast up to create the earth bank on the inside of the ditch, which in later years has then washed back down and eroded and washed back down and filled in the ditch again. So originally the bank would have been at least twice as high as you currently see it, I suspect, if not a bit higher. That erosion, though, unfortunately means we've lost all evidence of what might have been on top of the bank. But what seems to be, we're reasonably confident, is that there was no stone wall on the top. There's no evidence of tumbled stone in the ditch itself. There's no other sort of big areas of sort of stone demolition or foundation trenches were still linked with the bank. So we don't think it had a stone wall on top. It may have had a timber palisade on the top and we've just lost the evidence for the post settings for it because of the erosion, or it might just simply have had a really sturdy hedge line or something like that on the top, or fence. We don't know. It would still be quite, even with just a nice properly layered hawthorn hedge, for instance, would be quite an obstacle to get through if you've got to clamber down into that ditch and then up the other side and then through the hedge. So a hedge could still act as a good deterrent. And despite the name castle, we probably shouldn't really be thinking of this as a fortified enclosure. We've got what is probably a security system to protect sheep wintering inside the enclosure over the winter. Given the area is right on the edge of Leicester Forest, which stretches 16 miles to the west in the medieval period, and then just over the other side of the valley, you've got the Charnwood Forest, which was much wilder and has known outlaws within it. You would perhaps want some security from cattle rustlers or sheep rustlers, perhaps at the very least, on a site like this. But it's not, the castle is misleading. It's definitely not a castle. It's not fortified in that sort of same sense as a castle would be or a hill fort would be. So here it is, a handful of very grotty medieval pottery that wasn't one of those most spectacular finds you can show on TV, but was a key find in that it was coming out from beneath the bank. So it conclusively proved that the bank was built, and at the earliest that the bank was built in around about 1250. So it can't have been built predating the Knights Hospitaller's tenure either. It's being built sometime around about the time they are actually granted the site or the manor. We've also investigated one of the two central mounds in the site. So when you look at them, they're not always obvious to spot because they're quite low now, and again in the long grass you don't always spot them, but when the site's mown they really do stand out. They stick out quite obviously. So we did investigate one of these. We investigated the easternmost one because it was the one close to where a possible structure was in the Geophysical Survey, and by doing so we could investigate both at the same time. When you see them, they do sit right on the sort of the skyline of the site. When you're looking up on the site from the valley, you would definitely see the westernmost one against the skyline if it was a little bit higher. And so when you look at them, one of them's perfectly circular, the other's not quite so circular, but you do think perhaps could they be Bronze Age barrows, for instance, or medieval windmill mounds, or perhaps, as later history of the Deer Park, are they viewing prospect mounds for viewing the sort of scenery? And it first looked quite tempting when we put a trench across the easternmost mound. Initially, it did look like it had a stone curb running around the base of it, and we were sort of going, oh, this is quite exciting. This looks like this is a deliberately built stone structure. But this was where the hazards of doing long, narrow trenches come in rather than wider open areas. Because when we went back and investigated it the following year, what we realised was the stone curbing round the mound was actually the stone curbing round the hollow, not the mound. It was going in the opposite direction. And that rectangular anomaly effectively is that stonework, and it's surrounding a load of tumbled or loose stones, sort of forming a curb around the hollow. And what we realised once we'd excavated the hollow is that what we're probably looking at here is it's a pond, effectively. It's a reinforced edge round a pond, perhaps for cattle or sheep, or maybe for the deer. There's no obvious dating for its construction, but effectively the earth mound next to it is all the soil dug out of the pond. So an interesting understanding of an element of the monument, but not the most exciting of features to uncover. We still haven't excavated the western mound, though. Now that one does look more intriguing. It is perfectly circular. It doesn't have an obvious source for the soil. There's no nice hollow next to it, suggesting it's just dug out of a hole. And it does, when the grass is really short, look like it might have a ditch running around the mound as well. We do have permission to look at it. It's one of our research questions. It was our reserve trench last year. If we ran out of archaeology in the other 3 trenches, we were going to investigate it, but the other 3 trenches kept us too busy, and we didn't have time to actually open it up. So it's one of our future, if and when we go back, it will be one of our hopefully future research questions, is to investigate the western mound. The main focus of our work so far, though, has been in this big area of trenching right in the middle of the site, trenches 3, 6 and 10, where we keep expanding the area because of what we're finding in it. And we think this is the main focus of the buildings within the enclosure. The Geophysical Survey then showed this as just this generic area of modern rubble as it was interpreted. And we initially just put one trench across it just to test what it was. But as soon as we put that trench across it in 2016, we realized, yes, it is rubble, but it's not modern, it's medieval. What it appears to be is the demolition layer for the destruction of stone buildings or stone founded buildings across the site that has then been spread out across the site. So when you strip the very thin topsoil off, given that it's been a sewage farm for 70 odd years, you'd have thought the soil would be a bit richer and thicker, but it's not. It's a really thin topsoil just covering this rubble layer, and the rubble layer itself has really helped protect what's underneath from some limited plough damage, we think, and also some damage from the sewage works itself, with all those sort of channels being cut across the site. The rubble then is all local field stones and granite from just over the valley from the Charnwood Forest area. And then scattered amongst the stonework, there is also then large dumps of broken roof slates that are being scattered. Some look like they've just been left where they were discarded. Others look like there's been a bit of sorting during the discarding process, and others look like they've just been left where they've been thrown down or fallen down off the roof effectively. And they tend to then cover areas of stonework that, when you start removing the dumps of slate, start turning out to be wall lines rather than just loose rubble. They have a regularity and a construction to them that isn't just loose rubble covering the rest of the site. So you get these big dumps of roof slates. Again, all local Swithland slate from just over the valley, mostly coming from around about 5 miles to the west. From the colour of it, is coming from the quarries about 5 miles to the west. There is a mixture of sizes. The largest ones we've had are about 60 centimetres in length, and the shortest ones are only about 10 centimetres in length. Most of them are squared with a central drilled hole, for a wooden dowel or peg. But there are amongst them, there are a few, this one here, for instance, I'm sort of hovering over with the mouse now. That looks like it's probably a reworked Roman one. This big one over here is definitely a reworked Roman one as well. And these, you can distinguish these because they were originally fish scale shaped or diamond shaped, and they have a pecked hole rather than a drilled hole. So there is some slight recycled Roman material in here. And it looks like they were probably graded up the roof. So your largest ones were at the bottom and your tiny ones were at the top, just beneath the ridge line. And some of the tiny ones also, I do wonder if some of the tiny ones may have been reused as other sort of decorative lines in the roofwork, but some of the tiny ones again are sort of almost fish scale shaped and perhaps would have added a little sort of frill beneath the ridge line perhaps, or a little bit of decoration within the sort of the rectangular slates over the rest of the roof. The ridge line itself was ridged with glazed ceramic tiles. Each of them, and lots of these were found on site, all smashed up. And in general, it feels like the buildings have been deliberately dismantled. This isn't a building that's been left abandoned and collapsed naturally. It seems to be deliberately dismantled, and much of the good material has been taken off site and used elsewhere. What we're getting is evidence that the roof slates are perhaps being deliberately thrown down off the roof rather than sliding as a mass. There's no evidence that they slid off as a mass. It seems to be that they're more being individually taken off and thrown down, or the ones that are already broken are being thrown down. We're definitely not getting enough slates to cover the entire roof of the building. So we could presume certainly the bigger slates are going off site for use elsewhere. Most of what we're getting is the smaller ones that are perhaps not worth taking off site and the broken ones. The ridgeline then, the tiles are all green glazed and they all have these decorative little horns on the top of them, or loop handles. And we're getting them in two different fabrics as well. So we're getting Leicester splashed ware, which really the latest date for that could be 1250. So that it would just about fit with construction of buildings at the beginning of the Knights Hospitallers' tenure at Beaumont. And then we've also got Chilvers Coton fabrics, so they would effectively cover the rest of the time the Hospitallers held the manor. And so perhaps we're seeing a fabric that was used at the initial construction of the site, and then we're seeing a different fabric being used for later buildings and repairs and new constructions on the site. The one on the left is the Leicester splashed ware one with this simpler horn decoration. The ones on the right are the Chilvers Coton's ones with these sort of double looped handles instead, and then the higher quality glaze on them as well. And once you've removed all the rubble over the top of the site, so a good example of the rubble is this bit that hasn't been removed yet on the right hand side of this photo where the archaeologists are mostly working. You start underneath it then getting stone wall lines. Inside the wall lines seem to be simple earth floors for the most part, and then surrounding them on the outside are areas of, it's not really cobbled yard, the stones aren't big enough to be cobbles, but it's a gravelled yard. It seems to be pebbles effectively tipped over and then sort of driven into the underlying clay to create a hard wearing surface, and it's on top of that all the roof slates sit. You can also see the evidence of the sewage farm running through it. That the ceramic pipe running diagonally across this photograph is one of the pipes from the sewage farm. But what has actually transpired is that the damage from the sewage farm is actually quite contained. It seems to be no worse than land drains running across the site. It's just a whole series of pipes running, widely spaced pipes running across the site that are then pumping out fluid onto the ground surface rather than it being dug deep into the archaeology. So there's not actually a huge level of disturbance to the archaeology. I mean, one of our research questions was, given that they'd scheduled the site in 1980 with no understanding of what was actually there other than the earthwork, one of our key research questions was what had survived the sewage farm. And it seems to be actually we've got a really well preserved medieval site here beneath the sewage farm. The stonework is all mud bonded. It doesn't look like it was ever much higher than what we see now. So it's footings for higher timber structures, we think. We've got evidence of multiple phases of construction. So in this photo, the original wall is the one I'm moving the mouse along now. It's got a later extension on the left-hand side that seems to be using more weathered field stones rather than the angular stones of the original wall. There's a doorway exiting the building in the southeast corner as well. We've also got a faint hint of an internal partition running across just in front of the bulk in this particular trench. And then there's other buildings going off to the west at the back of the photo as well. In the 2017 excavation, which is effectively under the spoil heap in the on the top right-hand side of this photo, the 2017 excavation sort of did a transect across the middle of this building. And again, it found most of the walls still there. They have been robbed of stone in places, but inside the center of the room, there is this huge area of stone paving that has suffered intense heat. And we've got evidence of two central hearths. The final hearth seems to be on this stone paving, which may be the remnants of a wider stone paved floor. But then there is an earlier hearth underneath it, more or less in the same position, but this is actually on an earth floor. So the building, when first constructed, seems to have just had a compacted clay floor inside it that then may have been upgraded to a stone paved floor later on in its use, or the stone paving may have just been for the hearth. Either way, the fact that we've got a central hearth here indicates that this is a hall that is open to the roof. There is no floor above it, so we're looking at a hall structure here. So when we put all of this evidence together, because we've never seen this building in one go. We've seen it in a whole series of different trenches over 3 seasons of excavation. So this is the trench we excavated last year in 2021. When we add that to the evidence from the 2 previous seasons, we've now actually excavated about 2/3 to 3/4 of the building, we think. It survives best at its southern end, and then it gets more and more truncated as it goes to the north, and that partly might be because the ground drops off to the north as well, and it's just suffered because of that ground dropping off. It's just suffered a bit more truncation. But what we've got here then is very minimal damage from the sewage farm. Everything really that has destroyed the building seems to be a deliberate act of demolition at the end of the building's life, rather than later truncation and damage from later land use. And then underneath that, then we've got the remains of the building itself. So it's about 7 or 8 meters in width, and it's at least 18 meters in length, and it seems to be divided into 3 separate areas. It's probably 4 bays of timber framing, with a single bay at the southern end partitioned, a double bay in the center for the central hall that is open to the roof, and then another northern bay at the other end. There are then an extra extension to the south, some sort of lean-to structure perhaps has been added onto the south side of the building, and then there are extra rooms off to the east and another complex of structures, including what looks like it might be a corridor leading away to the west. At the minute, we don't know where that's going. We're wondering if it's leading to other buildings that are off west of the excavation area at the minute. Unfortunately, I mean, there's going to be more buildings than this. It's a farm. We would expect to see barns and all sorts of other structures, everything you'd need to run a successful manorial estate. At the minute, we don't know where they are. And the problem is the geophysical survey, as it doesn't show buildings, effectively to find them, we'd have to strip the whole site. And that's where Historic England would not allow that as a methodology. We need something we can actually target with a legitimate research question. So future excavations, we might end up heading off to the west because there seems to be something leading us off to the west. But off to the south, it just seems a large area of yard surface. And stripping that just to see if there is a building there is hard to justify at the minute, given that we have got to protect the monument as well. What we seem to be looking at then is a very typical medieval hall structure, where we've got this central open hall. On the south side, then it looks like we've probably got the service range. The room to the south does look like it also has 2 doorways within the partition as well. So we think it's probably the service range leading to a buttery and pantry, with a door exiting out of the room into the service yard. And then at the northern end, we think we've probably got the solar block perhaps and parlour, with other buildings, perhaps guest buildings heading off to the west. Again, we think this corridor here going off to the west, that might be marking again the location where the screens passage would actually go across the hall as well. Still not entirely sure what the structure to the east is. And then we've also got evidence of other features around the building, including the large hollow here at the bottom of the photograph. On excavation in 2017, turned out to be a stone-lined well that had the upper stonework significantly robbed out. And really key here to proving that this was a timber building was lodged on the top of this stonework and preserved, because the well was still waterlogged, was a huge quantity of preserved wooden timbers that all seemed to be coming from the remnants of a timber structure. And given the demolition material dropping into the well that seems to relate to the building next to it, we think these timbers are probably from the building as well, and they've been thrown down the well when it was sort of filled in, and they've ended up lodged on the stonework, but because of the high water table in it, they've remained preserved. It's not entirely clear exactly what bit of the building it could have come from, but they seem to be most likely roof timbers and bits of wall plate and other bits for wattle and daub, holding sort of wattle and daubing together. And putting all of this evidence together, then it looks like effectively we've got a structure very similar to, as an example, the Guildhall in Leicester, where we've got a stone plinth lifting the base plate for the timber framing off the wet ground effectively, so keeping it dry, and that the bulk of the hall itself would have been a cruck framed construction most likely, and entirely timber framed, with a local slate roof then with the glazed ridge tile. A few other things that sort of give us hints to other elements of the building. We have had an iron key come out of the demolition material. That could be from a chest or a lock on a door, but we've also had a small quantity of melted lead waste and lead window canes. So we've got at least one glazed window somewhere on the site in the building as well. So just because it's timber framing doesn't mean this isn't a grand building. And it would be quite a striking statement within the local landscape. It's built right in the northwest corner of the earthwork. It's in a position where it would actually be framed against the skyline if you were down in the valley looking up at it. To protect the timber, the walls would have been plastered and whitewashed every year, so you've got a white wall building probably with a blue slate roof, green glazed ridge tile. This is a building that would stand out and be quite striking within the local area. You'd certainly see it from quite a way around if you were making your way to it. And of course that might be deliberate. Knights Hospitaller sites were designed to give hospice as well, and that included travellers travelling through the area who could stay for the night and be put up by the hospitallers. That whole hospice idea is hospitality and hospital. It's both. It's caring for the sick and the poor, but it's also providing hospitality for travellers and shelter and security for travellers. So we have clearly got a substantial medieval manorial site on the top of Castle Hill. It seems to have all the makings of a manor that dates to the same period that we know the Knights Hospitallers hold Beaumont, the manor and land around this area. But where are the Knights Hospitallers? Do we actually have any direct evidence for them themselves? Can we definitely link this site to the Knights Hospitallers? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. We haven't found a single object from the site that says, hi, a Knights Hospitaller lived here. Our best clue, though, is the dating evidence. Our construction evidence all suggests that this site wasn't built until the mid-13th century. And our pottery and other domestic materials seem to support that idea. So of all the pottery we've recovered from the site, and it's a huge quantity, it's over 2,000 sherds of pot we've recovered from our excavations now. We've only got 7 sherds of 12th century pottery, so only 7 sherds of material that predate the Knights Hospitallers. Given that we know there's medieval ridge and furrow running underneath the bank and ditch, this is probably pottery that has ended up in field systems from the village of Thurkeston, rather than it actually being anything to do with occupation on the site. In contrast, we've got over 2,000 sherds of 13th to late 14th century pottery. We know the Knights Hospitallers then occupied the site, held the site from around about 1240 to 1482, 1483. So we certainly seem to have a major occupation phase that dates with at least the first half of that tenure by the Hospitallers. We've also noticeably got no distinctive late medieval wares from the site. They're noticeably absent. We've got no Midland purple ware, no Cistercian ware, nothing that you'd expect to suggest 15th century occupation on this site. In fact, the assemblage is entirely consistent with activity from about 1240 to about 1375, certainly no later than 1400, which gives us a little bit of an enigma, given that the hospital has held the site until 1482. In terms of the vessels, we're getting quite a mixture of domestic wares. We're getting mostly jars, bowls and jugs, with some specialist cooking vessels. So we've had some pipkins and dripping dishes. We've also had a unusually high number of bowls and jugs, glazed jugs, tableware type things, which may indicate that there's some specific processes going on the site that we're still exploring, but it might be, for instance, evidence of dairying on the site or something like that. We have cooking wares and tablewares, but it seems to be an unusual high number of jugs and bowls that in ones and twos you might think of as tablewares perhaps, or for baking bread, or limited sort of use of milk, but the quantities suggest we've got perhaps something more industrial scale going on, perhaps a dairy or something like that, and the processing of milk, potentially to make cheese or something like that, or sheep milk to make cheese as well, of course. In terms of other finds, we haven't had a huge amount, and it does actually feel like the site has been very thoroughly stripped of everything of use. There also, from the excavation last year, for the first time inside the building, we started to get a suggestion that the building itself had perhaps become derelict for a period of time before it was deliberately demolished. So we still believe it was deliberately demolished, but it looked like it had actually perhaps gone through a prolonged period of neglect before that. There was large quantities of soil building up inside the building that didn't seem to be new floor surface. They seemed to be material just generating naturally inside a derelict building. We also had the remains of a deer carcass that seemed to have died inside the building as well. So we're now starting to wonder if the pottery might be actually giving us a clue to why the hospitallers gave up the site. It's starting to look like perhaps this was a manor site that was functional until 1375, 1400, but after that perhaps went through a period of neglect or even abandonment. And the reason the hospitallers were so willing to give up the site in 1482 was perhaps because it was already a defunct manor by that stage, and that the land for them and maintenance of the land, something they'd already stopped maintaining, wasn't worth arguing with the king over, when he was offering a very profitable rectory that would have given, raised large amount of money through tithes without sort of with minimal work, was a good deal for them. So we've had a few little bits of rubbish. We've got iron knife blades that have come out. We've had a lovely little lead plumb bob come out. We have had some earlier material come out as well. There is a very small scattering of Roman pottery coming out of the site, but again, like the 12th century material, it's probably just evidence of Roman farming. We do know there is a Roman site just about 200 meters down the valley from our site, so it's probably coming from there rather than a Roman site in our site. Again, supporting the idea it isn't a hill fort, we've had absolutely no Iron Age pottery come out of the site at all. And the one bit of evidence we've got for people on the site then perhaps is, and I just like it because it is evidence of a person, is the little bit of fired clay on the bottom left-hand side. You can actually still see the fingernail impressions and the fingerprint impressions of the person who was pressing that into a wall that have got fixed because it's got heated by fire at some point. You can see the little curving impression of a fingernail, and there's a finger or thumb impression here, and other sort of ridge lines from either fingers or a little bit of fabric. So it's a little direct connection with a person on the site. But again, we don't really have a lot of evidence. The other problem we've got is because of the way the site's been deliberately demolished, we haven't actually uncovered any direct refuse deposits that we can link with specific buildings on the site or specific rooms and locate specific activities to most of this material. What seems to have happened, most of this material is coming out of the topsoil overlying the demolition deposits from the building. What we think has happened is the building's been deliberately dismantled. The building rubble that hasn't been taken off site has been spread out. And then any surviving middens on the site have then been spread out over the top of the demolition layer to regenerate topsoil. And so all of our evidence of occupation on the site, all this huge quantity of medieval pottery, the vast bulk of it is actually coming out from a layer that postdates its demolition, but must relate to the building underneath it. But it just isn't in its original location anymore. We have had a couple of stratified finds, though. Things that actually directly relate to the building itself, including our first coin. Sadly, we did not find the one on the left. The one we found is the one on the right. But it's a short cross silver penny from Henry II, minted somewhere in 1236, 1242. So again, it is dating right to the beginning of our site, 1240, when the hospitallers acquire the site, perhaps. So it's right at the beginning of it. And this is coming out from a ditch that seems to be an early feature running along one side of the building, or a drainage gully might be or from the eaves, perhaps, might be a better way of looking at it. But this seems to have been something that's actually been lost in that ditch during the actual habitation of the site, rather than it being a residual find from later on. We also do have evidence of one process going on the site. We've collected across the building area a huge quantity of iron slag. It's all hearth slag. It's not evidence of iron smelting on the site. It's evidence of a blacksmith or iron working on the site. So we've got lots of waste ore. We've also got at least one pottery fragment with molten metal stuck to it. And we've also got around that central hearth within the main hall, again, more evidence of hearth slag, including fragments of hearth bottom, but we've also got hammer scale coming out of the charcoal deposits around the final hearth. So going back to this idea that we've got perhaps the main manorial building on the site, but it's gone through an extended period of neglect and decay at the end of its life, it looks like one of the final uses of it was as a blacksmith smithy, again supporting the idea that the manor house has gone down seriously in its fortunes over the years and is just being used as a workshop towards the end. There's also a little bit of copper alloy mixed in with the iron slag, so there might be evidence of multi-use metalworking of the hearth. We've also got melted lead waste coming out from across the site. So we've definitely got evidence of a blacksmith and some limited metalworking going on the site, but it doesn't seem to be any more perhaps than what you'd need for at a farm level that an estate centre might have used, rather than it being a mass sort of production area of metalwork or an iron smelting area. Our final trench last year, then, we decided to go and have a look at this westernmost bank and ditch, easternmost bank and ditch, sorry. It was again unclear. It's listed as a specific part of the scheduled monument. So the scheduled monument describes the main enclosure, the eastern bank and ditch, and the fish pond. The fish pond we haven't looked at yet, mainly because of various ecological issues involved with it, and it needs a bit more careful planning before we decide what to do with it. It is described as the best preserved medieval fish pond or dam for a fish pond in Leicestershire. It seems to be a bit more monumental perhaps than just a fish pond. I do wonder if the dam for the fish pond, perhaps they were trying to create the dam, the various streams, to create a head of water for a mill that perhaps was never built or was further down the valley. But as I said, we haven't had a chance to investigate the dam yet because of various rare species of plant and wildlife in the pond area. We did put a trench across this eastern bank and what was described as a bank and ditch, and what the LiDAR does sort of suggest is a bank and ditch. Sadly, it turned out to be the most boring trench of the entire project, which is why it did not feature in Digging for Britain, who were only interested in the interesting stuff, understandably. But it has actually made us start considering the wider landscape around Castle Hill and how Castle Hill sits within that wider agricultural landscape on the top of the high ground, and how it must have linked with the surrounding settlements as well. So what it turned out to be was there was no bank and ditch. It was just a bank. The ditch itself turned out to be what looked like a hollow way. So it wasn't a deliberately dug ditch, drainage ditch. It was a much wider feature than that, with the bank running along the edge more representative of erosion within the hollow way than actually a deliberately constructed bank. And we think it's probably the remains of a hedge bank running along the side of the hollow way. But it made us start thinking about the site, because we'd never previously considered it as a hollow way. It had always been interpreted as a bank and ditch, and we'd been thinking of it more along the lines of, is it evidence of a park and pale surrounding the later deer park, or some feature like that? But when we then start looking at photos like this, where you can clearly see the ridge and furrow, you can also clearly see this bank running along the edge of the site here. We know that the site entrance links with that bank or crosses it as well over here, the one entrance we have identified. And you can see all the ridge and furrow on the west side of it all runs parallel with it. But then on the east side, you can see ridge and furrow in other fields sort of curving away from it, leaving this gap here. And I'm starting to wonder if we're now actually seeing the system of drove roads and little trackways between the fields, linking our site to the wider landscape. And so here we've got an area surrounded by ridge and furrows. Perhaps this is where they're driving in the sheep from the higher ground further to the south and to the east, through the ridge and furrow that's an arable ground that immediately surrounds the site. But also this trackway here heading off to the north, the one going off to the right, is heading directly towards the village of Thurkeston. So we may also be looking at the earlier trackway system amongst when this was still originally part of the manor of Thurkeston. So we might be looking at the landscape that predates the Castle Hill as well, that is then being sort of reused and reutilised by Castle Hill. So it's giving us a chance. We can only see this in photos. Most of this is now built on. We're having to go back and sort of look at old photos to extrapolate all of this now. But it's starting to help us sort of fit in within a whole system of trackways that cross this high ground, this ridge of high ground between that was sort of traditionally called Leicester Forest, which was a mixture of woodland, pasture, forest meadow, and was really the common ground for the city of Leicester during the medieval period, as well as forming large areas of sort of private hunting reserves for Leicester Abbey, the Earls of Leicester, later the Kings of England, as it morphs into a royal hunting lodge. So we're not finished with this project. We're still analysing the results, so there still will be more information to come out, but we still do have scheduled monument consent for 4 more years after this, and we do have unfulfilled research questions already pre-agreed with Historic England. We were hoping to go back with another student and community dig this year, but that probably won't happen because I'm tied up with another project. But what we're hoping is maybe next year we'll be able to go back. It won't be on the same scale perhaps as what we've done previously, but we are hoping we'll get back and answer some of our, I mean, there's never going to be an end to the questions, but there are still a few nice little things that we can wrap up. And it would still be nice to have an investigation of the fish pond. But I think at the minute, the 3 years we've done so far have definitely helped clarify what the monument is. It's proved it is entirely a medieval landscape and medieval feature. And it's going to give us an interesting insight into Knights Hospital and manorial estates. Surprisingly, not many of them have ever been excavated. Knights Templar sites either. The best example is a Knights Templar site in Lincolnshire at South Witham. And that is often used as an example of what a preceptory should look like. But the fact that we've never excavated any of their other estates to the same level of detail means that we don't know if it's a typical or atypical example. So this has been a rare opportunity to investigate. It's not a preceptory, obviously, but it's one of these member sites, one of these dependent sites, to give us this sort of extra level of understanding of these sites. And manorial management in the East Midlands in general, again, in the East Midlands, it's fairly underlooked at. Manorial sites. They're generally scheduled monuments and aren't rarely often looked at these days. So again, another rare opportunity to investigate medieval sort of manorial systems within Leicestershire and the wider East Midlands as well. So I've got to say a big thank you to all of our community volunteers from the first 2 seasons, all of our students from last year, and also all of the returning volunteers who helped out on the weekends last year. We could have never done this project without all of those people involved. I mean, there's probably around about 100 of them now and counting. Some people are students who have graduated and gone on to work in archaeology as well. Others carry on returning and carrying on digging. The park volunteers have been instrumental as well, because they've formed sort of the core volunteer base for the project as well. So they need all a big thank you for making this project possible. And if you haven't watched Digging for Britain, and if you do want to ask any questions about it, I'll cover them in the questions at the end. But it's still available on BBC iPlayer, and it's Series 9, Episode 4 is the one you want. And it's available for another 9 months, so you've got plenty of time to watch it if you haven't watched it already. And thank you for listening. If you do want to know more about the project and follow it, the website there, ulasnews.com, searching for the Knights Hospitaller, is the one where we will be posting regular updates. And when the final reports come out, that's where we'll post them as well and post links to them as well. So thank you for listening.